In 2008, Square Enix released the video game titled The World Ends With You for the Nintendo DS. In 2008 was also the same year that other more popular games were released, such as Call of Duty Modern Warfare, Wii Sports, or Devil May Cry 4. The World Ends With You was overshadowed by those more popular games. Even though the Nintendo DS had 70 million units sold at the time, therefore the audience for the game was large, the Nintendo DS was nevertheless seen as a system that meant for more casual players. Therefore, it wasn't like a game. It wasn't like a system where you would expect a game to create lots of meaning to be. It sold 370,000 units worldwide, and apparently only 160,000 units of those were from English-speaking countries. The game can be considered niche, however, it nevertheless turned enough profit because it was priced at $40, and it eventually got 2 re-releases as well as a sequel that's coming out a month from now. I argue that The World Ends With You, especially the DS versions, use its game systems almost perfectly, all of them together, in order to create a very, very meaningful experience. In order to do my research, I played the DS version a couple of times, as well as the remake, the Nintendo Switch version titled Final Mix versions of the game. I did a close analysis of the games, as well as any research online that corresponds to me making when it comes to video games. The main goal of my capstone was to understand how does The World Ends With You brings together all of the game systems together in order to make a meaningful experience. One, the first question was, how does the World Ends With You do it when it comes to the narrative? Two, how does the union of the combat and the gameplay connected to this narrative create a meaningful experience? And three, to what extent is meaningfulness lost in the 2018 remake of the game when it was ported to the Nintendo Switch version? The World Ends With You takes place in a fictionalized version in the modern-day town of Shibuya, Tokyo, Japan. The explorable areas include the famous Scramble Crossing in the epicenter of Shibuya, along with all of the adjacent streets, such as Hachiko Statue, the Shibuya 109 department store, as well as HMV Records, which is like a store that sells exclusively music and nothing else. Narratively, the game takes place across 3 weeks. While during narrative moments the game often sets fake time limits for the players, the game can actually be enjoyed at one's own pace and takes roughly 25 hours to complete, which is considered the shorter JRPG than most. Well, it seems like because of copyright costs, the names of some of the stores have been changed or slightly remained. It appears that everything is pretty much accurate to how Shibuya was in 2008 when the game was first released. The game follows a 15-year-old boy named Neku Sakuraba. The manual describes him as a fan of graffiti, but less enthusiastic about forging relationship with others. He's very introverted, and at least a third of the game he's considered very asocial. Interestingly, it appears that Neku's name is phonetically similar to the Japanese word for cat, neko, and this makes sense because, cats are considered shy. Neku suddenly wakes up in the middle of Scramble Crossing and realizes that he's unable to interact with anyone that's alive moving around him. This is because it is revealed that Neku is one of the many players of what's known as the Reaper's game, and he's considered dead. He's in this game, which serves as a chance for him to be brought back to life. Neku can only interact and be seen by other players in this game, or Reapers who are hosting the game, and numerous shops who have special graffiti plastered around their walls. The Reaper's game is 7 days long, and players are given tasks each day, such as, get to X district in X minutes, or defeat all the noise in X district in X minutes. So long as one of the pairs of players complete the daily task, it counts as everyone completing it. Yes, each player, including Neku, is apparently supposed to pair up with another partner, otherwise they cannot complete any of the tasks. Neku's first partner is a girl known as Shiki Misaki, a 15-year-old girl who wears her own designed clothes. Neku soon realizes that he doesn't actually remember anything about his own personality. He just knows his own name and the fact that he likes graffiti and music. This is because it is soon revealed that each player has been forced to give an entry fee to play the game. The entry fee is what each player values the most. Due to Neku's self-centered nature, his entry fee was actually his own memories, which is then returned to him after 7 days. As Neku becomes close to Shiki in those 7 days, it becomes clear that Shiki, while seemingly outgoing, talkative, and much more social than Neku, she in fact hates herself. On the 6th day with Neku, for example, she says, "I was never pretty or smart. There was nothing special about me at all. I hated myself. I wanted to change, to be somebody else." As it's a bit expected, Neku becomes close to Shiki and helps her change, as well as becoming friends with other characters. Obviously, by the end of the story, Neku changes as a character, grows as a person, and manages to defeat the game. While I talk more about the narrative in my paper, in this short video I'd like to talk about what I found to be much more meaningful than what the narrative covers, which was the gameplay and the game mechanics behind the narrative that's present in The World Ends With You. Fashion is considered huge in Shibuya. To miss out on the latest trends, you pretty much might as well not even try. So instead of using armor and like swords and such medieval stuff in the combat system, The World Ends With You actually uses the fact that Shibuya is such a fashion-centric place that articles of clothing and pins, which were popular at the time in 2008, are considered the weapons and the armor in the game. Moreover, instead of having like elements to each of these like armor, such as like normal JRPGs using like fire armor or like water armor or like other elements, The World Ends With You instead puts a brand to each one of these clothes. So one article of clothing might be stronger against the other depending on what's popular, and there might be brands that are considered not popular in a certain district and they are completely ineffective in attacking the enemies in the game. In fact, each of the pins of Neku's partners use, which can't be changed, they're predetermined, they're chosen specifically because they follow their signature brands matching their personality. Beat, for example, has quite an explosive personality and often makes rash decisions throughout the narrative. Therefore, the pins and clothing he uses are of a brand known as Wild Boar, which the character in the Chinese zodiac is described to have an explosive character itself. Beat, for example, uses the pins Fly and Fresh Line, which launch enemies in the air with literal explosions. The player, therefore, is encouraged to switch up their pins to brands which are considered trendy in specific areas, or wear clothes with the branding their pin set has in order to modify the trends to more advantageous ones before engaging in more difficult combat. Since certain articles of clothing and brands are considered unpopular in certain districts, those don't do as much damage as another article of clothing would. The player is therefore encouraged to switch up the pins or brands they're using to engage in battles more effectively, or the game also allows you to actually brute force into making your own brands popular. There are no restrictions on what clothing you can wear at any part of the game. However, some clothes have like what's known as a bravery requirement. Bravery is a stat that you can increase by doing more battles or like progressing in the story. And usually clothing which is like more flamboyant or like somehow odd looking or maybe more eccentric requires higher bravery. So in short, this is a clever way that game mechanics and not the narrative itself exemplify and demonstrate the importance of fashion conscious Shibuya. The player is being always pushed and pulled to engage with each of the fashion, and because it's like telling you to not be in style, your character is literally weaker. Shibuya sits in a fascinating place in Japan. While the rest of the country, individualism and individualistic ideas or desires are kind of suppressed in favor of traditional collectivism, in Shibuya such individualism is praised and has become a hub of self-expression. Yet at the same time, it seems like clothing and styles of idols are followed in Shibuya and ultimately drive what's popular and what is considered last season. So basically people become so self-aware and follow like a specific person that perhaps this collective consciousness of individualism may actually breed what's referred to as corporate puppetry, because like everyone might be following like a specific brand. This ultimately serves as a very interesting backdrop in what The World Ends With You is trying to do. It's using this gameplay mechanic to show you that, hey, you're supposed to expand your horizons, be individualistic, but at the same time talk to others and all that, but you know, perhaps that we need an actual balance that a lot of us struggle to do because of where we are. I argue that the combat system is the most significant part of meaning making in The World Ends With You. On the Nintendo DS, it takes place on both screens at the same time. Neku is on the bottom screen and is controlled exclusively by the touchscreen. You can drag, you can tap, you can like slide, and depending on the pins you have equipped. On the top screen, it's Neku's partner and is controlled exclusively by the buttons on Nintendo DS. Each of the three characters that become partners for Neku, those being Shiki, Joshua, and Pete, play ever so slightly differently, but still use the buttons only. The narrative spent a significant amount of time talking about how you need like a partner to survive in this like, you know, Reaper's game.
And instead of just telling you, it pretty much shows you in the gameplay. It's the same enemies on both the top and the bottom screen. So like if an enemy is defeated on the top screen, it's also defeated on the bottom screen. What happens is that the player is basically controlling both characters at the same time using different input methods. And that serves as a metaphor that people play differently, people deal with situations differently. And at the same time, it doesn't mean that you can't make use of them. You cannot defeat enemies with just using Neko on the bottom screen. And you cannot defeat enemies with just Joshua or Shiki on the top screen. You need both characters simultaneously. I argue that the solo mix and final mix versions of the game pretty much miss out on this important little detail. The iPad version, for example, is a single screen, and like both characters can be seen on the same screen at the same time. Instead of using buttons to control the secondary character, the player is just supposed to tap while doing the other moves Neko does. It's a bit strange that even the Nintendo Switch version of the game does this, considering that it does come with a set of buttons on the side, but it's probably because they wanted to keep parity with the iPad version. So in short, the game seems to have been made around the Nintendo DS when it comes to its combat, meaning that this cooperative gameplay ties with its central thesis of the narrative that kind of doesn't with the Switch version. The Switch version's narrative just tells you that yes, you're supposed to use your partner in order to defeat enemies, but the Nintendo DS version just shows you. So the form of storytelling that appears because of this dual screen nature of battles isn't present in Nintendo Switch version. Of course, in my paper, I also talk about some advantages of the Nintendo Switch version. For example, there's an extra scenario that pretty much links to the idea of imaginative play that the game is trying to go for. And also the fact that maybe since the Nintendo Switch version is like a wide screen, it sort of seems like a panoramic view of like Shibuya as it was in 2008. And at the same time, it's not like Square Enix called this version like the definitive edition of The World Ends With You, but instead they call it Final Mix. Because in music terms, remix or like a mix is pretty much defined as taking the original and adding and altering some aspect of it. So it basically serves as a different take on the same story.
While my paper goes into far more detail about how The World Ends With You creates meaning, the conclusions are ultimately threefold. One, that the setting is extremely crucial to the meaning making of The World Ends With You. While in other JRPGs, fantastical elements like castles or like medieval places are not so relatable, even though they do create like a cohesive narrative, the fact that The World Ends With You takes place in a city that they're kind of similar to ours with actual roads and like people who might be obsessed with fashion is very, very crucial. We don't know kings or queens or assassins around the world, but we do know people who are obsessed with fashion. We do know like a girl or a guy who has some kind of suicidal ideation with like having trouble at home. The second is that The World Ends With You was uniquely designed around the Nintendo DS's hardware. It doesn't work the same way on the Nintendo Switch because of this whole like expanding your horizons idea. It works a lot better on the Nintendo DS because your partner is on the bottom screen, separated but you're one, yet you're also working together at the same time. The gameplay mechanics of the combat therefore play a very, very crucial role in creating meaning making. It's showing you a lot more than just telling you. The Nintendo Switch version tells you you cannot defeat enemies because you don't have a partner, but the Nintendo DS version just shows you. And the third is that through my research, I realized that the gameplay mechanics are far more important than a narrative. It doesn't really matter that Neko. And the third is like gameplay mechanics seems to have played a far more important role than the narrative in order to create this meaning making. The World Ends With You cannot work unless it's a game, because you're the one who's using all those gameplay systems. You're the one who's learning to reach out, to exchange, to try different things. As I'm recording this, The World Ends With You has an anime, finally, after 13 years. Yet it's doing a lot of telling rather than showing, because an episodic format of a TV series is just incapable of doing that. In the future, I would like to see more analysis on JRPG games, because it clearly seems to be something there. The Yakuza games, for example, this is a game series which there were 6 entries, and ever since the 7th entry, they announced that the whole entire franchise is changing the genre because it's just more meaningful when it comes to like a JRPG. How do other games that don't take place in real world places, like Nier Automata that takes place in a more fantastical post-apocalyptic place? Apparently the game seems to cover eternalism and ideas about existentialism, and it's interesting how that game uses its JRPG mechanics to do so. What could also be interesting is analysis on other genres. For example, EA's It Takes Two and A Way Out are like one of the only games in the world that actually require you to play with a second player on the same couch. How does this type of game create meaning? Because it forces you to play with another real world player that maybe you're not so familiar with. How does it create bonding experiences? And how does such a game, which like is changing the aspect ratios like to show different stories, having simultaneously, how does that work? And to end conclusively, how The World Ends With You, which finally has announced a sequel that's coming out next month, how is it going to create meaning when it's not on its Nintendo DS system? It's apparently the game is getting released on the PC, PlayStation 4, and the Nintendo Switch devices, which are all vastly different devices with different control schemes. The PC is a keyboard and mouse. The Nintendo Switch has those things at the side, and the PlayStation has like a classical controller. Is the meaning making not going to be done from the controls or the way the game is played, or is gonna do something that's unique to those systems? These questions are currently unknown, and there won't be research on them even for a while after the game comes out. But it's an interesting place to look for meaning making. I think video games can do a lot of meaning making, far more books or movies, and I think the analysis is interesting.